Welcome, everyone. Thanks for braving the rain outside. A grey evening in Brussels. It's great to be back. My name is Sam Fleming. I used to be bureau chief here for the FT until last year. I'm now economics editor based in London. I'm delighted to be here with you and to talk about a truly fascinating report, which hopefully some of you have been able to take a look at, or if not, will be able to soon, Geopolitics and Economic Statecraft in the European Union. It's obviously a terrific time to be speaking about this, and in some ways a very troubling time. Needless to say, people will have noticed the news overnight out of the US and the implications this has for the global economic order. One of the great success stories of the EU has been projecting in the past. It's a more rules-based and neoliberal economic approach to policy around the world, but this post-war economic model is clearly, as we know, under massive strain, and that is intensifying as we speak with the latest news out of the future Trump administration in the US. Now, obviously, this has been a trend which has been underway in some time, and the EU has already very much changed its modus operandi when it comes to many of these issues, which was part of what I was covering when I was here for 4 years with the FT. But the change is, if anything, accelerating now. And we have a terrific panel, really, to discuss this topic for the next hour or so. Here. I'm going to open with a conversation amongst ourselves with the initial presentations of the research, just for those who haven't had time to read it yet. We'll then have a debate and open it to questions here in the room and also online. Delighted to be joined by those online also around the world, as well as here in Brussels. So first of all, let me introduce my excellent panel. Immediately to my right is Rosa Balfour, who's the director of Carnegie Europe here in Brussels. Sinan Ülgen, senior fellow to her right, also at Carnegie Europe. Sabine Weyand, who's the Director General of Trade at the European Commission, and to her right, Nicolas Véron, who's the Senior Fellow at the Peters Institute of International Economics based in Washington, who will be able to, and indeed in Bruegel, so be able to offer a point of view from both sides of the Atlantic. I'm going to start, Rosa, if I could, with you, and Sinan, to give us a sense of the research and why, in a sense, you undertook it and where you've ended up.
So thank you very much, Sam. Thank you all for coming. Let me just take advantage of this. I'm not moderating, I normally sit in your chair, just to say I'd like to thank all the authors. I'd like to thank the speakers for coming, joining us today. Some of the authors are in the room, some are connected online. But I'd also like to thank our team for putting together this report, which was really quite a big effort, for coordinating the project, for working on the layout, the production of the paper. It's been a great team effort, so thank you very much. What I'd like to do in my opening remarks is really just say a few words about why we decided to do this. This for me is quite a departure. I normally do foreign policy issues, but one reason is very simple, that in the world we're living today, we really need to find space for a far better discussion between economists and foreign policy people. We live in a different world from that point of view, and I think think tanks needed to upgrade the type of work they do and the type of thinking, the type of questions they ask in order to better understand the world. So that is reason number one. The second is that we've been living here in Brussels in an environment in which there is constant talk about crisis and how the EU manages to move forward in the face of crisis. And of course, we've been living through a crisis since at least 2008. And through a lot of this time, really, what we've seen is just muddled through policy responses, crisis management. So the question is, is it any different? Has it been any different since COVID, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, since Trump elected the first time around and then the second time around? And I really wanted to roll out a project that would analyze the degree of change, the meaning of that change, and that's really what we wanted to do. And the big question is, how different is this? Why is it different, and in what ways? If we look at European integration from a historical point of view, we obviously have moments that have brought about big change. I mean, the first is obviously the end of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods system, The second period of big change, I think, started in the 1970s with the oil crisis. There was political fallout. I think there are quite a few interesting analogies to be made with the 1970s and today. And it was, economic and political conjunction. That led to the single market and, of course, the treaty in the European Union. And that was kind of peak European Union integration. And I think now we are in the midst of this phase of huge change, which is political, economic. It's global, but it's also very local and domestic. And we don't really know what's at the other end of this period of change. And I think that is what we've tried to address in this report. Now, we tried to do it looking at a number of areas. Some of these are emerging policy areas that previously didn't really exist. Others are upgrading existing policy areas. And I think all the authors who've contributed with their research have really identified that these are, we are at a juncture, and that there are a lot of choices, there are a lot of risks, and there are a lot of dilemmas out there, which we need to discuss. We need to talk about them, and I think we need to have the language and the grammar to understand that. And in a way, when I was looking at what the US has been doing during the Biden administration, looking at the speeches coming from a number of representatives of the Biden administration, for instance, Jake Sullivan, talking about the new sort of post-neoliberal world, I had a feeling that in Europe, the debate is not actually framed in those terms. It's more about, pursuing a certain policy and finding the tools to do it, but not thinking bigger picture and where are we going? What is Europe's role in the sort of emerging, fledgling, post-neoliberal world? And, the big questions there. What is the role of the state? So normally we have that discussion at national level, but actually we have to have it at the EU level. What is the role of the EU in regulating? Now there's a big discussion about cutting red tape everywhere, right? And Trump is going to pursue this. And how is Europe going to respond? What is the role of the state in regulation? What is the bargain between economic objectives and foreign policy objectives? How can they interact with each other in a meaningful way? These are questions that actually we haven't talked about in the European Union because we have depoliticized economics. We have made economics technocratic. We have made it, following a certain logic, whereas the politics and foreign policy in particular were following a completely different logic. And what is the impact on the rest of the world? We're beginning to see some discussion over this, but this is, Europe falling from a pedestal in which it felt it could, project its values and norms, and that they were benign and would be benignly accepted by the rest of the world. So if there is a departure from the previous setup that justified European integration, what are we looking at? Or what is this fledgling new European Union? Now, I don't want to talk about the international dimension because Sinan is going to do that, but I just want to make one point, which I hope, Sinan, you will accept, that it's actually for the EU to shift from a context in which its international identity was built around the notion of interdependence, to shift from that to an understanding of weaponized interdependence actually means rebooting the EU. It means reprogramming the EU. So it's actually big. And it also means that the EU needs to think about what its role is in multilateralism, which again is part of the EU's DNA and has been a consistent goal of its international action, and a rules-based order. But then there are also internal questions, and this I'll say perhaps a few more words on this before passing the floor to Sinan. So because there is a war in Europe, because Trump is about to go to the White House and has already threatened trade tariffs, we are moving towards a phase in which everything is getting securitized. We've already had the phase in which migration was securitized. Now we've got trade. And of course, there is war in Europe. But there are risks that come with the securitization of everything. And I just want to put it out there, and maybe we can talk more in the discussion, but that is one thing I wanted to point out. Another is the fact that the European Union integration has pursued over the years around a political compromise between centre-left and centre-right parties, and this is a shrinking centre. So what is the political bargain around the next stage of European Union integration? What are the ideas driving it? And what kind of consensus can one find among our political parties, which is what people are voting for? What about the norms of European Union integration? The single market has been possible around a set of norms that protected competition, protected small member states vis-a-vis the larger ones. How are these norms impacted by the choices that are being made, and what kind of solidarity among the member states can we envisage? I would also add that the sort of introduction of norms relating to economic security, to foreign direct investment screening, etc., they require a different bargain between technocracy and democracy for that to have political legitimacy. And I think, again, this is an issue that actually is not discussed enough in the EU public realm. And finally, what are we looking at in terms of what kind of animal is the European Union going to evolve into? How similar will it be to what we've known for the past 50 years, and how much will it differ? And I think, again, this is something that needs to be addressed because the risk is of overreach. The risk is that the EU is no longer able to provide solutions, that it becomes irrelevant, or that it is not able to face the various challenges that you mentioned opening, and I'm sure we'll talk about today, because it doesn't have the right setup. So that's why this report came about, thanks to working with Sinan and with other colleagues. And that's it. Those are the sort of my opening framing comments, but I'd like to leave the floor to Sinan for further elaboration. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Now, one of the definitions that we relied on of economic statecraft was the following. Economic statecraft consists of using economic means to pursue / achieve foreign policy goals. And as the case may be, as reminded by Sam a while ago, yesterday, we had probably one of the most egregious examples of economic statecraft, if we agree by this definition of economic statecraft. The president-elect, Trump, threatened two of America's major economic allies, incidentally like-minded nations, with import tariffs, so an economic policy tool, if they did not address more effectively two foreign policy / political objectives: curtail drugs trade and inhibit more effectively the inflow of illegal refugees. Now, this is economic statecraft par excellence, if you agree with the definition. However, it is not at all the type of economic statecraft that we would like to champion, recommend for the EU. However, it illustrates the core concept that I want to talk about today, which is the external consequences, the external implications of economic statecraft with the EU setting. Now, more often than not, when we talk about EU-level policies, and some of, would use different terms, economics, although they're not, totally similar, they still refer to, by and large, very perhaps alike notions: economic statecraft, economic security, economic resilience, open strategic autonomy. All of them have external implications, and they involve trade-offs. Now, the interesting thing is that we know more about the internal trade-offs that they involve. The reason why we know more about the internal trade-offs is that this happens in a town where, with all your contributions, we know basically what is happening. I mean, just read the reporting on the foreign direct investment screening regulation. You understand who says what their positions are, whether, which country is defending which point of view. These are the internal trade-offs. We know more about the internal trade-offs than incidentally about the external trade-offs. And this is exactly what we wanted to do with this work. We wanted to, and here's the Murphy's Law, yeah? We wanted to make those external trade-offs much more explicit, given examples about each of them and how they relate to each other. Because fundamentally, they actually pose significant dilemmas. And we need to internalize them to be able to advance more effectively in this now much more challenging environment. So, for instance, when we talk about carbon leakage, sometimes in the rest of the world, they hear green protectionism. When we talk about technological sovereignty, they hear about digital divide. They hear about unfair IPR rules. So that is, to some extent, some of the notions that we wanted to make it clear. The other big dilemma when we talk about the external environment is how this, very internally driven aspirations can align or not align with the external order that we want to protect, which is the norms-based multilateral environment, the open economic and trading system. And some of the examples that we give in the report, and I'm sure DG Trade has done, copious work on that, so, you can please correct me, but, some of these instruments on the surface, and not just on the surface, but when we talk to, some of the people who deal with these matters external to the EU, there are claims that they're not necessarily in compliance with these multilateral rules, with WTO rules. CBAM, is it compliant with the WTO MFN rule? We shall see. Critical Raw Materials Act, is it compliant with the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement? We shall see. The CHIPS Act, is it compliant with trade-related investment measures or trade-related intellectual property? We shall see. Net Zero Act, same. Export control regime, a strengthened export control regime, is it compatible with the GATT stipulation of basically no barriers to export rules, except in national security circumstances, which is, by the way, limited, interpreted in a very narrow manner by the WTO. The foreign subsidies regulation, the scope goes beyond the SCM agreement. And at present, there are no really internationally binding rules between the nexus of subsidy regimes and domestic production. So therefore, all of this constellation of policy measures internally have the potential to be, out of conformity with the proper system that we as Europeans also have created. And especially today, at a time when our major partner, quote unquote, in crime, in building this, norms-based multilateral economic order, has taken a direction of travel that's contrary, that's totally inimical to what we have done for so many years together. And as a result, the role that the EU may be asked to champion, whether it likes it or not, whether it is ready or not, is to be the key and single most important actor to ensure the survival of this rules-based order 4 years down the road. And that's the question mark, whether we are ready to do that and how we are going to be able to do that. So if this structure is going to survive, it is by making these mature decisions about how we want to reshape the post-neoliberal world. And this requires truly understanding the external implications of the policies that are embedded in these very different initiatives. Now, this, if we're going to go down that path, and I think there's a clear call in our compilation that this is exactly the type of task that the EU should acknowledge and should certainly pursue, that there is a need for a more constructive and understanding dialogue with, for lack of better word, the global South, which will start by acknowledging this external impact, this law of unintended consequences. So ultimately, the report also has a number of recommendations, and I won't list all of them, but just to give you, the gist of what we're trying to say. That there are two levels of engagements that we're trying to outline here. One is the political and one is the policy track. The political track means that we need to create a more collegial political environment where we can discuss these external implications. And the track there really, and we see some of this in the ongoing discussions, is one to avoid Western centrism. And what I want to make clear here is that it would be a dangerous fallacy in this instance, at a time when we need this engagement with the global South, to assume that what we are doing here, all the political initiatives that we have will basically be accepted by the rest of the world merely because they are justified, and they are justified by moral and ethical considerations, whether it's fighting climate change or preventing social dumping. You can add all these ambitions there. But that's a trap. It doesn't follow from the fact that we believe that these are justified on moral and ethical grounds, that they are going to be accepted. So that's where the political track is fundamentally needed. And then the policy track, where we outline, again, a number of recommendations. One of them is a revision of the global subsidy regime, which I think is indispensable if we are going to ensure that the type of industrial policies that are now increasingly being espoused, starting with the US, but also in the EU, whether it's the IRA in the US, whether it's the European Chips Act, well, they are essentially balancing our own commitments to the multilateral regime and are more, interventionist, perhaps, induced by geopolitical shocks, other shocks, revision of industrial policy. So a revision of this type of, the subsidy regime, where we could possibly do carve-outs from good subsidies in order to advance this, regime of industrial policy in a less confrontational manner. Other areas of revision, special and differential treatment, obviously the reform of the dispute settlement, WTO, how we're going to interpret the national security exemptions. And fundamentally, we need to adopt really the WTO and multilateral rules to this big and necessary push to make sure that our own aspirations for building a greener world, a much more climate-friendly world, is compatible with the direction of travel of our economic priorities. And the multilateral institutions should essentially be revised in order to achieve this compatibility. But and as a final word, I think we drafted this report before the outcome of the US presidential elections. But when I went back and read it with this new development, I became even more confident that this was an analytical work that we had to do, and that the time is right, and hopefully it will indeed trigger the type of conversations that we want about the exact role that the EU wants to play in protecting the multilateral based order.
Okay, so there's a lot to respond to there. I suppose if you to summarize the question, perhaps at this stage, following that presentation, what kind of animal, as Rosa put it, will the EU evolve into in this era of egregious economic statecraft? Will it be a standard bearer for the liberal order, or is there an ongoing drift away, in a sense, already visible, as Sinan has been arguing, in EU policy over some time, and perhaps it's time to embrace that reality?
Thank you very much for having me, and I think it's indeed a very interesting and very timely report, not because of the US elections, but because of the start of a new college. I think this is food for thought. And of course, I will not be able to do justice tonight to the richness of the report. But actually, I'm quite happy about that because this allows me to be selective in my response to what I've been able to look at. And I would like to focus my remark on 5 points. Now, the first one is the definition of economic statecraft, because I think we need to have a definition of economic statecraft that is EU style. I stumbled over the definition that you also read out, which you can find throughout the report, which says economic statecraft consists of using economic means to pursue foreign policy goals. Well, that is not, I think, the EU style of economic statecraft. And actually, I found a different definition in another chapter of the report, which I think captures much more what we are trying to achieve. And that is that we are developing a kind of statecraft where economic policies serve broader strategic goals alongside policy-specific commercial objectives. Now, this is not splitting hairs, and that brings me to my second point, which is why does this matter, this definition? In the EU, we are not defining economic statecraft as the subordination of economic policies to foreign policy objectives. What we want to do is, and it is an aspiration, not yet a reality, I recognize that. What we want is the coordinated deployment of all EU economic tools, internal and external, for the pursuit of our strategic objectives. And I will respond to the criticism of the absence of the bigger picture that Rosa referred to. But why does this matter? Because if you apply a foreign policy mindset to economic questions, you risk ending up applying a balance of power lens to economic interdependence. The consequence is that you look at economic relations in a zero-sum game approach. And I don't think that that is conducive, or our experience of how things have worked in the past and what is the basis of our prosperity, which is that economic interdependence is in principle a win-win proposition. I say in principle. And where I agree, we have a shift, is that of course we are now much more alert to the risk of weaponization of interdependence. And we need to guard against that risk without, however, throwing out the baby with the bathwater and losing the benefits of economic interdependence, which are still there. So I think that is the challenge for economic statecraft EU style. And you can already see from this discussion and from what you quoted in the beginning, economic statecraft lies in the eye of the beholder. Because one party's economic statecraft is the other party's coercion or weaponization of interdependence. And I think we have to be aware of that. And we have to be able to change perspective if we want to understand the impact of policies that we are taking. So, do we have an absence of EU strategic objectives? I would argue no. And I think we have, as I said, the aspiration, if not yet the full realization, of deploying our policy tools in line with these strategic objectives. What are they? Competitiveness, sustainability, and security. Of course, this is a triangle of objectives which will not always function in harmony. So we will have trade-offs between the objectives, but we will also have to manage trade-offs at the level of the instruments. But that's politics and policy. And from that point of view, managing conflicts between objectives and instruments, that is what you have at EU level, but you also have it in any political entity. So that's not surprising. So we recognize that there can be tensions. We recognize that there can be trade-offs. But the fourth point I wanted to make is I take issue with the statement in the report that there is an overcorrection towards a defensive approach. I think this is a matter of perception, and I can understand why there is this perception. Because what is new is indeed the fact that we are not saying economic interdependence is good, full stop, but we are saying we have to be careful about the risk of weaponization and we have to guard against that. And we have developed a whole set of new policies and new instruments. And obviously the focus is always on the new, rather than on the continuation of policies that is also there. But that is a distorted view then if you only think What's happening is the new. We are not, yes, there is a shift from the pursuit of economic efficiency to resilience. But that doesn't mean that the pendulum goes full swing and stops there. Yeah. This is a gradual approach. And again, it's a question of getting the balance right. Now, so I'm saying this, what the report says about overcorrection is exaggerated. I'm not saying that the risk doesn't exist, but we also have insurance policies against the risk, because we have set out a policy where we say, okay, we have our economic security strategy, which basically says openness has served the EU very well, and we want to preserve that. But at the same time, we have to be able to guard ourselves against abuses of that openness. And that is why we have a three-pillar approach to economic security, which emphasizes the promote dimension, the resurgence of the role of the state is part of that. Industrial policy is part of that. And yes, we need to look at the international consequences of that. We have the protect pillar, the instruments where we protect ourselves against abuses. They are security related, like FDI screening, export controls on dual use, outbound investment we are currently discussing with the member states. But there are also level playing field instruments, whether that is trade defense or whether that is the international procurement instrument. And of course, everyone is focused on how will they deploy these new instruments, because many of them have not yet been road tested. TDI, of course, is old policy, yeah. But a lot of the new instruments, we don't really yet have a doctrine of use. That is something the next college will have to look at. That is part of the attributions of the incoming Trade and Economic Security Commissioner. We also have shown our awareness of the risk of an overcorrection by saying we want to be evidence-based. So our economic security policy is based on risk assessments and our overall policies on impact assessments, taking into account also, and that is also something that the Letta report put on the table, taking into account when regulating the impact on our international partners, which is perhaps something we've not done enough in the past. So I take this criticism. By the way, what I found interesting, Parliament once told me, we have developed all these Green Deal measures during the pandemic when none of us was able to travel. Now that we are going out there meeting people, we are much more aware of the impact of what we are doing. So I think, you know, we can also learn from that experience. But it is a challenge we have to recognize. So we are aware of the trade-offs, we have instruments to deal with them, we have principles that in our actions we need to be proportionate and precise, targeted. I think with that, we also have a setup in the new college which helps us manage these trade-offs, because we have trade and economic security in one portfolio now. So we will be obliged to design from the beginning the different pillars of our policies together. The open trade policy, the promote policy, the protect policies. They all have to come together. And it is clear that for all three of the strategic objectives we have, competitiveness, sustainability, security, we will not be able to reach a single one of those without partnerships. So we will not turn inward looking because we can't afford it. And I don't really think that there is much of a risk in this respect. That brings me to my fourth point. I also take issue with another statement in the report, which is that there is a tendency towards defensive measures rather than proactive initiative to shape the global order. And that links to Sinan's point, saying, will the EU continue to be the standard bearer of multilateralism? We have to be the standard bearer of a rules-based system out of sheer necessity, because that is how you keep 27 member states together. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And that is also something which is implicit in the report, but it's never spelled out. Economic statecraft is a lot harder for an entity that is not a state. But we are doing economic statecraft, we're trying to do it, we are developing it for, you know, an ensemble of 450 million citizens living in 27 countries. So every progress we make is massive, even if it may not live up to the ideal. that we have, the aspiration we have, that every progress we make has major repercussions. And we need to remain rules-based for our own purposes. Now, does that mean that we are defenders of the status quo? No, because the current rules-based order is not fit for purpose. And that is why we are the standard bearer, not for the multilateral system as it is, but for WTO reform, and reform in general, to make the multilateral system fit for the challenges we now face. And here we are taking a lot of initiatives. I mean, we are leading with others, with like-minded countries, the reform in the WTO. We've been pushing in the WTO an agenda to look at exactly industrial subsidies, because we recognize that there are externalities. And we think we need to have a discussion about what type of industrial policy, what type of subsidies are even necessary in order to master the climate change challenge, and what are types of support which are so distortive that you have to try and get rid of them. Actually, during the first Trump administration, we made progress in the trilateral discussions, US, Japan, EU, on defining criteria for permissible or prohibited subsidies. It then did not really come to fruition, but you know, there was some progress in the discussions we had there. But we are the sole defender of this agenda in the WTO at the moment. And the problem with multilateralism is you cannot be multilateral on your own. You need partners. And that means that you really have to have a lot of strategic patience. We cannot afford to give up on it. We are committed to it. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we also need to be able to take action on our own, where the level playing field cannot be leveled, or where the level playing field cannot be ensured through WTO reform and an update of the rules. And actually, this is not a departure from open trade. Assertiveness, as we've called it in the last mandate, is a prerequisite for being able to maintain political support for openness. If we are not able to show that the current system as it is allows us to take essential action to level the playing field, to pursue effective climate policies in line with our commitments under the Paris Agreement, if we are not able to show that, we do a disservice to the multilateral trade rules, because then the reaction will be, well, if we cannot pursue these legitimate policy objectives in a non-discriminatory manner without falling foul of the current rules, there's something wrong with the rules. So we also want to show that we have the policy space we need under the rules. And we stand by the proposals we have made. And if you look at that, you can see that we justify in each and every case how these proposals we have made, which are now law, how the laws that we have are actually compatible with the WTO. That doesn't mean that others may not have another judgment on that. At some stage, there may be a WTO panel pronouncing itself on this. But we are confident that we can stand over what we have put forward. And I think that is important, because if the WTO rules are perceived as a straitjacket that doesn't leave you policy space, it will not be an attractive proposition, not for the EU, but not for anyone else either. We are also using other formats like the G7 and the G20 to shape the global order. The discussions we have been instrumental in moving forward on overcapacity, which is a major distortion of international competition that we have put forward in the G7 that we are pursuing. We had a big conference this week in Brussels on overcapacity. We are developing standards for resilient supply chains with others in the G7 again. We have the critical minerals partnerships, which are explicitly looking at the interests of resource-rich countries to make sure that this is a win-win proposition and not a zero-sum game. Mineral security partnership is something we want to take forward. And of course, also all our bilateral relations are also a contribution to rules-based trade. So we should not underestimate that. And the other thing is, I very much want to pick up, for want of a better word, the reference to the global south. I think we are at risk of focusing exclusively on the US and China. Of course they are. I mean, the US is our biggest trading partner, and they're our biggest investment partner and a security partner, and our security partner. So we have to find a way to work with them, whoever sits in the White House. China is, well, depending on how you calculate it, the biggest or the second biggest economy. It's our second biggest trading partner. So that's very important. But there's a whole world out there that does not want to choose a camp, but that wants to navigate a global economy in line with their own policy aspirations. And these are partners for us. And perhaps we are not doing enough yet to take care of these partnerships. Let's not forget, with all the importance of the US, they account for 15% of world imports. So there's a whole economy out there with whom we can partner up and diversify our relations. And my last point, fifth point. There was somewhere in the report a reference to a victimhood approach of the EU in the global economy. And I very much agree, victimhood is not a good look and it's also not justified. Yes, we are living extraordinary times, but we should also, and yes, we have been muddling through, but we have not been muddling through worse than others who don't have the challenge of being a multi-level governance system. And actually, sometimes you only see, looking back, just how far you got with EU integration. And I would argue that we have a lot of assets to navigate in also today's world, whether that is our enormous network of trade agreements. We are the biggest trading partner for 72 countries around the world, accounting for 40% of GDP. That is not nothing. That we have a single market, yeah, which is not perfect, but it is pretty good. So from that point of view, yes, there are challenges for the EU. Yes, statecraft is more difficult for a multi-level system as the EU, but we should not talk ourselves down. We are quite good at that in Europe, to see everything. I'm all in favor of being self-critical, yeah, and I don't like complacency. But at the same time, we have to be careful that we do not fall in the other extreme and only see what doesn't work yet, and do not see how far we've come and all the assets we have to navigate what is coming our way. Thank you.
Nicola, your response from your transatlantic point of view, so based in the US, but also deeply familiar with the EU and all its workings, how convincing do you find the agenda and the arguments that Sabine has just spelled out for us?
I will agree with much of it, but first I want to thank the Carnegie Endowment for first inviting me, but primarily for publishing this report, because I think it's a really useful contribution. As this discussion has already illustrated, it's a great way to stimulate proactive thinking about the issues. And I think the most important thing, the report, as you know, is a collection of essays. They are essays written from diverse perspectives, and I think this diversity is what makes the report really interesting. So, I encourage everybody to read it. Also, thanks again for having me. They've all read it before coming here. Yeah, I know, but read it again, which I will do too. There's a kind of unique affinity that I feel for Carnegie, because in Washington, D.C., my office is just across the street from Carnegie Endowment. Here it's just down or up the street from Carnegie Endowment, so there's a kind of nice symmetry there. Sabine had the luxury of 5 points. I will make only 4. I will try to make them very quickly. The first point is just to echo what she said about our tendency to talk ourselves down. And here I will take issue in her fashion with one claim the report makes, which is the peak of integration was in the 1990s. I'm not sure that's true. It certainly cannot be stated as a fact. I mean, obviously we all are aware of the achievements of EU integration in the 1990s, and they're significant. But if you take just the last term, the EU did Next Generation EU. It did react very forcefully to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It did things that nobody thought possible, including in the US, like the immobilization of Russian reserves. It did provide a prospect for membership to Ukraine, which to me was a major policy and political and strategic achievement that was not, to be taken for granted. And in my little area of things, which is financial services, yes, it didn't create a capital markets union, it didn't complete the banking union, but it did completely reform its framework for anti-money laundering, which is actually a big deal. So I think sometimes EU successes don't get enough attention. And we're all culprits of this kind of, I mean, let me be slightly, I don't know if that's emotional, but there is a lot of reflexive control, as specialists call it, going on. I mean, there's a lot of discourse going on, including through various channels of influence that, the EU is a failure, the EU will fail, Ukraine is losing the war, Trump is the future, and so on and so forth. We have to push back at that. This is an organized campaign to make us distrust ourselves. And we know from where it's organized, not primarily from Beijing, but from another beautiful city. So we have to push back. My second point is essentially echoing what Sinan said about the rest of the world. I won't call it a global south because, like Alan Beatty and others, I think it's a horrible expression, but I will call it the rest of the world, which in a way is not us, not the US, not China, but the rest. And that rest of the world, if you want not the G7, we can discuss. That rest of the world is a big place. It's a very diverse place. My point is not to say we have to model our attitudes on their perceptions, because that would not necessarily be wise. But I think it is critical for all of us to become much more aware of those perceptions than we have been in the past. We have been lazy. We have looked at the US, we have looked at China. In a way, the Draghi report, in a good way, in my view, echoes that. But there's a big world out there, which is not the US, not China, and not us. So I would say, go travel, also to China, by the way, but not only that, let's have a discipline of keeping awareness of what's happening outside of our comfort zone. My third point is, again, echoing one of the previous speakers, and that's again Sabine, the rules-based order. Let's not lose sight of the fact that the economic rationale, beyond the point which Sabine rightly said, we need the rules-based order because that's our glue inside the EU. If we don't have the order, the EU unravels. But I think there's an even deeper point, which is the economic rationale for openness hasn't changed. It's still there. Many people want to forget about it. Many people say this is fake news. It's not fake news. So let's not forget that we have engaged in interdependence, in the way of interdependence in the EU for a reason, because when we lose sight of the need for the EU doesn't make a clear statement that it's willing and able and preparing to support Ukraine to the extent Ukraine needs, not just with money, which Ukraine has at this point, but with weapons, with buying weapons from the rest of the world, including the US to the extent needed, then Ukraine will be viewed, as it is in the campaign of reflexive control organized by Moscow, as losing. Because the support from the Trump administration cannot and will not be taken for granted. So we need to make a clear statement that irrespective of what Trump does, we have Ukraine's back. If we make that statement, Trump will join the winning side, and it will not be Putin. If we don't make that statement, we're in a much more dangerous situation. This is a matter before Trump enters the White House. It's on us. It's not on him. It's not about us reacting to whatever nonsense he puts on Truth Social every morning, which he will do, by the way, every single day of the next 4 years. So let's be prepared for that and not, react with, dismay. But this is our agency, so let's use it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to involve the audience quite soon with questions. Before I do, it would be, I'd love to hear, Sabine, your thoughts on it would be wrong of me not to mention the news yesterday from the US. I realize that the announcements were not directed, at least at this stage, at the European Union. Clearly, they have consequences for the European Union. higher tariffs, for example, US tariffs on China could obviously affect product markets in the European Union. How should the European Union respond, and what is going to come next?
What we have been doing and continue to do is that we analyze all possible announcements so that we can prepare for all scenarios. I've said it already before, our default approach is to say we are interested in a cooperative agenda with whoever sits in the White House, because there is a cement of the transatlantic relationship that goes beyond politicians, that binds together our societies, our business communities. There are trillions of investment involved. So I think this is a reality which will have its own weight. Now, we are also prepared for disruptive scenarios. But that is as far as I go. I will not announce now, because that's not for me to decide what will be the policy response. Our job in the Commission of the Civil Service is to prepare the analysis, to prepare the options, so that the political level has a menu to choose from. Now, that is obviously a choice that should not be operated in public. What we will do will depend on, the engagement, the signals we get, what we see as options to go forward. But as I said, we are prepared for all scenarios. And of course, we have analyzed announcements of the campaign in terms of their effect on the EU, in terms of effect on third countries, but also in terms of effect on the US. So all these announced initiatives have consequences in real life. And I think they will be measured by all actors involved. And I'll stop here.
There will be a lot of pressure on the EU from the Trump administration to align when it comes to policy towards China. And this is one of the areas where this has been a long-standing issue. This great power rivalry now, which is developing and deepening between the US and China, will continue to deepen under the Trump administration. And the EU is at the risk of being caught in the middle. How do you see, where do you see at least the trade-offs at least playing out first when it comes to the next commission?
Well, I think we have our own policy and our own strategy vis-a-vis China. And by the way, the still current US administration has been following Ursula von der Leyen's mantra of de-risking, not decoupling, because it captures what we are trying to achieve. It is, however, also fair to recognize that the EU, in terms of its relations with China, is not where it was in 2016, is not where it was in 2019. I think we are much more alert to the negative externalities of China's state capitalist system. I already mentioned before the overcapacity, which is just one manifestation. There are security issues. There is a lot of weaponization of interdependence going on. So these are issues we have been discussing with the US already. We are discussing already now. We have been discussing under the Trade and Technology Council and inside the G7. So we see that there are areas where our interests align. And there's no reason not to cooperate where our interests align. But our interests are, of course, also not identical. And I think we have to continue to pursue a path that corresponds to our own interests, which is to also maintain a relationship, what is, after all, a very big economy, a very big player in international affairs, a big contributor, but also part of the solution on climate change. So we have an interest in, yes, rebalancing our relationship with China, but also doing that through dialogue. So there are areas for cooperation, but our interests are not identical.
We obviously have a brilliant panel here, and I would like to involve the audience now in asking questions, because I'm conscious we're notionally at the end of our time here, but I think I'm right in saying that the panelists do have time to stay on for a little while, so I'm glad to say we're not calling it now. We can involve our audience. This question, maybe I'll take a couple of questions right in the front, and then Jim at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Finbar Birmingham here from the South China Morning Post. A couple of quick questions for Sabina, if I may. You talked about overcapacity a few times. Can you envisage in the new mandate perhaps a specific instrument for dealing with overcapacity, and what would that look like? Second question would be lots of media reports this week about a deal being imminent between the EU and China on electric vehicles. Is that true? Is there a deal close? What's your update on the talks? Thank you.
Thanks. And Jim Brunson at the back there.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm Jim Brunsden, a consultant with Fleischmann Hillard. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. One is about China. Now, in the first Trump administration, I think it's fair to say we saw a deliberate warming up of attempts at heightened economic commercial policy ties with Europe by the Chinese. We'd gone from a period of frustration with the Chinese over negotiations on an investment agreement to one where the Chinese were full throttle to try and conclude one with Europe, for example. And that seemed to be at least in part a response to China having to deal with the Trump administration. Should something similar happen this time and China suddenly seem to want to warm ties or open various doors for Europe, how should Europe react to that this time, given our experience with the Kai and the first Trump administration? It's a question for whoever on the panel would like to take it. And just secondly, in terms of these definitions of economic statecraft, well, one ongoing file for the EU, if I've understood it, is the reform of GSP Plus and the potential for conditionality to be attached to GSP Plus, that member states would like migration conditionality to be attached to those trade preferences. Is that potentially an example of the definition of economic statecraft that, Sabine, you don't like? And does it maybe have some parallels even to what we've just heard out of the US? Thanks so much.
Okay, 4 questions. I think, Sabine, probably all ones you could address, but I will maybe after you've responded to those, open to the panel, Jim's question on the frustration on how to respond to any warming notions from China. I'd be interested, for example, to get Sinan and Nicola's views on that. Sabine first.
That's me, okay. Now, I think on overcapacity, what we are currently looking at is what we had agreed in the G7 to have an observatory on overcapacity. And I think we are still at the stage of assessing the exact origins of this. This is also not a one country problem. I mean, overcapacities in steel, they have more sources than one country. So we are looking at that as well. And whether we need an instrument, well, that remains to be seen. So I think this is something that the next Commission will have to look at, but I am not going to curtail their freedom of reflection and action on that one. It's an issue which is being analyzed at this stage. Yes, I think there have been some quite confusing reports about a deal being imminent on battery electric vehicles. We have had 50 hours of discussions with our Chinese counterparts. They were constructive, but they have not led to an agreement on price undertakings, and there are structural issues that remain unresolved. So we think that we need to continue discussing with China, very much in the vein of what I said before. We have overall a critically unbalanced economic relationship. So there are lots of issues we need to look at, and also in the automotive sector, we should not just reduce that discussion to the battery electric vehicles tariffs, which have now been in place for several weeks, and China continues to export cars as we expected them to do, because these tariffs were never meant to stop the exports. They are meant to compensate for the subsidization, and that is what they are doing. But we need to have a broader discussion with them also about the way forward on the automotive sector, including as regards possible investments that are already taking place or have taken place by Chinese companies inside the EU, because we need to make sure that these are actually conducive to a more balanced relationship. So there's a lot to discuss here. So the dialogue will continue. On GSP plus, the Commission proposal was put forward a long time ago. Can't remember exactly how long, 2 years, I think. And Council and Parliament were not able to agree on this. One of the issues was indeed the link with migration. We had already in the Commission proposal linked this to link the benefits of the GSP to a respect of international customary law, that you take back your own citizens. So this is very much, was very much the subject of discussions. After many discussions, the Council arrived at a compromise on this, but the European Parliament rejected this. Now, we will have to see where the new European Parliament will take this. Given that this is a proposal in co-decision, we will play a role of honest broker on this one. But, you know, I don't think that all the shadow rapporteurs have even been nominated yet in the Parliament. So we are reaching out to the Parliament and we will see how we can land the GSP. For the moment, we have the prolongation, but I think we have a duty to update the system. So we'll see where that will land. And I leave the other questions to my co-panelists.
You feel free to answer it as well. I wasn't meaning to exclude you, but yeah, okay, Nicola.
On the relationship with China, very briefly, this is an oversimplification, a radical oversimplification, a ridiculous oversimplification of something much more complex, but here we are. The EU, since late February 2022, the most important thing is Ukraine. And the most important thing in the relationship with both the US and with China is Ukraine. So it's fair to say the Biden administration has not been exemplary in its behavior in matters of trade and investment, vis-à-vis the rules-based order and vis-à-vis the EU. But we have given them, I speak under Sabine's control, a lot of slack because of Ukraine. And that has been broadly successful because the US has been broadly supportive of Ukraine in a way which is critical for the EU. I know our support to Ukraine is not unqualified, the US support for Ukraine is not unqualified, but you get my point. I think the same is true for the Trump administration and for Xi Jinping on a continued basis going forward. So this is the most important thing. Depending on their behavior in that critical matter, that will determine the EU attitudes as it has done in the last 2 years. I expect that to continue.
Rosa, do you want to offer anything?
Yes. I want to take up the question on GSP Plus and the conditionality, not specifically that measure, but more broadly, you know, how to think about marrying foreign policy objectives with economic statecraft. What is legitimate, what is not? And there, the frame of analysis that I would like to submit are twofold. The first frame of analysis is whether we're talking about the positive conditionality or negative conditionality. I think that's important in determining whether what we want to do as part of that economic statecraft is legitimate or not. And secondly, whether the condition that is inherent in that equation is purely unilateralist, like what Trump has done or is trying to do, or actually has grounding in multilateral rules, in regional rules, or customary law. So that's how I would judge whether, you know, this economic statecraft is legitimate or not.
Okay. I have time for another couple of questions from the room. Right here, two people sitting right in front here. If we,
one of them is one of our authors.
Okay, great.
Raluca.
We need the mic. There we go.
Thank you very much for, first of all, the presentations. I have a question related to the buzzword technological sovereignty, digital sovereignty, and it's related to also the one of the pillars, competitiveness. Can the union be competitive in the digital age? And here I'm also referring to the Draghi report and some of the clear gaps identified in terms of the other pillars that drive the digital transformation: cloud, AI, quantum, advanced semiconductors, so on and so forth. Sinan also mentioned a couple of the technological domains. So my question for the panelists, given the needs for the next 21st century, where is Europe heading and whether it can be competitive and deliver for European citizens in this field? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not one of the authors, but one of the readers. I have a specific question to the last speaker and also to the panel. I fully agree with the analysis and the prioritization he mentioned concerning Ukraine and the need to stand up against the influence, the Russian influence, basically, which we are suffering from. The real question is, do you think this will happen? Do you believe this will happen? And from whom do you expect this act?
Thanks. And a question right here at the back, and I've got one I'll also throw in from online.
Thank you. Name is Adrian Kortspiegel. I'm actually a trainee from the Commission. My first question, I was glad that the compensation was brought up with the against Chinese EVs, which is meant to compensate for the subsidies that are put in place in China. But based on my reading, this has not been perceived as such or not been well taken in China, and they just sort of lumped it together with the US tariffs, which are much higher in fact. But here I'm wondering if the EU has done a well enough job of explaining its justification, which is to create a level playing field. And a second brief question is also concerns this concept of overcapacity, which I have a hard time making sense of, especially when it comes to solar panels and EVs, both of which are needed for the green transition, both of which are needed in large number for the green transition, and even under current projections, which include the overcapacity, we don't reach even the more ambitious climate targets. So what's the matter with overcapacity? We need even more capacity than the overcapacity we have right now.
Okay. Great questions. And one from online is a question on the state of play for Mercosur. So that definitely goes to Sabine, but perhaps on digital sovereignty, I could ask Sinan and, well, indeed, any other panelists who'd like to answer that particular question, because it is a really important one.
Well, it's a bit odd because she wrote the chapter on technology, and I'm just going to rephrase what...
Maybe I'll ask Nicola to respond to that one. That's a very fair point. Yeah.
No, I mean, you know, there's all this debate which is really interesting among economists, which is kind of taking momentum, and whether what is important is to master the kind of shiny frontier technology or to master the ability to adopt technology. And that's not the same set of policies. I'm a big believer in the fact that in the EU, even if we're not maybe the masters of the frontier, we can be actually quite good at adoption. That's a matter of education, of general education, of scientific education. And when you look at that, we're not the worst in the world. So I think there is some hope. I will stop there.
Okay. Sabine, quite a few questions there for you. Maybe Mercosur will be a good one. And also this question on, you know, the level of tariffs imposed in terms of EVs and overcapacity there. Thanks.
On Mercosur, I mean, we currently have a negotiating team in Brasilia. So I'm not going to comment on ongoing discussions at this stage. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not able to predict where this will land. And what I'm talking about is the technical teams. So there is always in each negotiation, you have a technical dimension and then you have a political dimension. So at this stage, I mean, when you get towards the final stage of a negotiation, it's very, very sensitive. I do not give a running commentary on ongoing negotiations, especially as my update was from last night, and I don't know what has happened today. So it would be irresponsible for me to venture more. What I can tell you is that the Commission will try to get the best deal possible and will only propose something for conclusion where we think that the balance between the benefits and the commitments is a good one. So I will have to stop here on Mercosur. Then I think on China, or us not having explained sufficiently what we were doing with the electric vehicles countervailing duties, I think this sounds like you're underestimating China. China knows exactly what we were doing. They react the way they see appropriate for their own domestic debate, but also with a view to creating divisions inside the EU. Now, why did they not distinguish more the 100% tariff imposed by the US vis-à-vis the rules-based measured response of the EU? Because the US doesn't even shrug a shoulder when they protest against this, Whereas in the EU, there are voices which are very sensitive to threats of retaliation or criticism or whatever. So I think China understands very well. We've had contact throughout this investigation. This investigation is a very thorough one. It's a legally scripted one, and all the data is shared with the parties. So this is an extremely transparent process, which you could, if you follow the way that we adjusted the duties at each and every step, that is due to interventions by the parties, including the Chinese companies, the producers in China. So there's no misunderstanding here. So on this question of should we not just buy the solar panels and the battery electric vehicles as cheaply as possible? After all, it's about the green transition. Now, that links back to the question of technology. Do we want to build our green transition on dumped or subsidized products from one origin, where we get into new dependencies? Is that a good pathway? Is that a good pathway to the green economy we are trying to build? I would say no. Now, there's also a distinction I would make between solar panels and BEVs. Because on solar panels, you could argue this is not a leading technology product. We can buy this wherever we can find them cheaply. There are also alternatives available to China, so the risk of dependency is not that big. It's there factually at the moment, but we could diversify. Battery electric vehicles, e-mobility is the future, and we cannot afford not to be part of that future. And we need to create the space for our industry to develop the economies of scale they need in order to be competitive. Now, not by closing our market arbitrarily, but by making sure that the competition that comes in on fair conditions. And that is why we said we are not just imposing tariffs in order to close our borders. We welcome competition, provided it is fair. So from that point of view, we have been fully in line with our objectives. And as I said, this is also about what is the place of Europe in the technologies of today and the future. I'm not a big fan personally of the expression of technological sovereignty. And I'm a native German speaker. Sovereignty does not sound as attractive in German as it may sound in other languages. Yeah. So I think that is also something we need to keep in mind, that what we mean is we cannot be left out of this race. We need to be able to innovate. Yeah. And I think that is extremely important, that we are able to compete. I'm quite attracted by the notion, if you look again at interdependence also in the technology field, I'm quite attracted by the Japanese notion of indispensability in technology. We have to be indispensable so that the rest of the world cannot move forward without us. That may require leadership in certain technologies, and we need to maintain a competitive edge.
Sinan, quick last word to you.
Yeah, just a quick last question, if I may, to you, Sabina. China-US question and your preparedness to what may come. Because if we indeed end up in a few weeks in a scenario where Trump says what he will do, the first order implication will be China reconsidering its export strategy. If the US market is closed, then the second market, the biggest market in the world, is European market. So more likely than not, we'll find ourselves in a situation where services will be deluged by requests by European producers to protect themselves against this onslaught of Chinese imports. And my question is, can you do that by staying compliant with WTO rules? Because when you look at US Section 301, ergo omnes tariffs, that's not really, but what you've described to me just a few minutes ago, the very articulate, elaborate, countervailing subsidy investigation, step-by-step, listening to everybody, sending delegations, is that going to be enough in your TDI instrument to protect European industries in that trade war scenario?
Watch the space. I'm not. Look, we will explore what is possible under existing rules. and under existing instruments, and we will assess the need for new instruments. But that's as far as I'm ready to go now. But it's obviously something we are looking at. So, I mean, the problem is clearly identified. But you know, there is value sometimes in being unpredictable.
Certainly a message Donald Trump would agree with, I think. Yeah, Rosa.
Very, very brief. Just a couple of 3 points, but I'll make them very briefly. The first is, I mean, I really appreciate the comments, the insights, including where there are disagreements. It's great to hear the creativity with which the EU institutions are trying to navigate this difficult period. I do think we have a massive problem in that there is a mismatch between politics in Europe and what needs and the global challenges. And that is something, that is one of the reasons for which it's important to have these discussions, because we need to move forward in the public debates. Second point on digital. My usual talking points on digital, which is not an area of competence for me, but you know, you've got the sort of China model. I bring out Anu Bradford, the 3 digital empires. The Chinese one is state surveillance, the American one is market driven, and the European one is regulation. Now, if in the and that rights driven, no, absolutely, yes. But the European and the American have been far closer to each other than they have ever been to the Chinese model. But when you have tech billionaires who are in power, then there is a problem, especially if the president of the United States is, you know, quite happy to put in the same statement fentanyl, immigrants, and tariffs, right? So you have a problem if the United States wants to pursue Elon Musk's agenda with respect to Europe. I think that is going to be a big problem. But I'll just put it out there. And then the third point, and just in response to what Nicolas has been saying about Ukraine and the overarching salience of Ukraine on every policy agenda. And there's one thing we haven't talked about, and I think it's one item that has been absent from the debate from the Draghi report, from the debate on Europe's economic security, competitiveness, etc., and that is enlargement. The EU has offered, accession prospect to Ukraine, Moldova, and now that rekindles the prospect for the Western Balkans, and there is a very strong economic rationale in favor of that. Which is about scale, which is about bringing in technological skills and know-how from Ukraine, for instance, into the European Union. And the debate, if you look, so there's actually quite a positive agenda that could be constructed around this idea of enlargement. But the debate, and this is something I do follow quite closely, is really stuck in, fiddling around with the institutions in order to allow for enlargement to happen. So again, there's another mismatch between economic opportunity of designing an economy of scale that can be wider, can be more innovative, and with war, the momentum is also very strong, for reconstruction and to rebuild. But that is completely at odds with the type of debate that is taking place in the communities working on enlargement. And I end here because I think this is a positive way to start building a different narrative as to what's happening in Europe around, what enlargement can bring and the benefits it can bring for the European economy.
Thank you. So for people who are in the room, drinks are about to appear magically from behind this screen. I'm told, at least we hope they will be. I have really enjoyed this panel. It's been fascinating. Obviously the European Union has changed a lot as an animal over the past few years, but we're in a more feral, in a sense, global economic environment. So that change will have to accelerate. And we've heard some really fascinating ideas about how that might evolve and during the next US administration, US Commission, and so on. So please join me in thanking the panel, and do stay behind if you can afterwards to say hello.